Few names in the history of the American mountain man are as legendary as that of Kit Carson. Carson's life is the stuff of legend, as he spent decades traversing some of America's harshest environments and engaging in some of its most violent conflicts. Tonight, join History at the OK Corral as we examine some of the most famous and infamous stories from the life of Kit Carson.
Wyoming, August 1835. As the heat of the day causes small rivulets of sweat to form on his brow, Kit Carson mounts his favorite horse, an unsettlingly coy smile stretching across his face. His pale blue eyes seem to boil with intensity, and his demeanor betrays a singularity of purpose that causes great concern to those close to him that know him all too well. Carson is angry, and there is going to be a fight. The sudden flurry of Carson's intense movements caused a stir about the previously placid camp full of mountain men, local natives, and fur traders. They have come here for the annual Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, the yearly gathering held just outside of what is today the census-designated area of Daniel, Wyoming, in the expansive Green River Valley. Stretched out along the banks of the Green River are an array of tents and teepees, representing a menagerie of cultures and goods for trade. Though there are several regional rendezvous, this gathering in the Green River Valley has become one of the largest. Though years before have been plagued with supply delays and fights with the local Blackfoot, this year's rendezvous is proving to be a roaring affair. In attendance are roughly 300 mountain men, roughly 2,000 Shoshone natives, several dozen members of the Nez Perce and Flathead tribes. Also present is a sizable contingent of company men from the monopolist Hudson's Bay Company. Many of these men are French-Canadian voyageurs, hardy fur-trading occupational cousins to the American mountain men. The rendezvous represents a unique opportunity amongst the tight-knit, multi-ethnic community to gather together in relative peace and safety in order to barter, trade, and simply enjoy the company of friends they had not seen since the rendezvous the year prior. The world of the frontier is indeed intoxicating in its freedom and autonomy, but it is also undeniably hazardous, unforgiving, and often deadly. The opportunities for recreation and relaxation are often few and far between, and the occasions to socialize with friends and colleagues even rarer. Thus, the prevailing mood at most rendezvous is one of communal excitement, camaraderie, and kinship. Though the mighty Blackfoot are an ever-present threat, disputes amongst participants in camp are generally kept to a minimum. Instead, the order of the day, in addition to the aforementioned festivities, is that of business. The trappers have worked long and hard for an entire year, often spending hours knee-deep in frigid streams, setting their traps and enduring all manner of hardships, from Blackfoot attacks to maulings from grizzly bears to simply disappearing into the vast expanse of the wilderness, as so many countless did. At the rendezvous, the trappers bring their year's bounty to have it appraised by the fur merchants, who would then issue payment in the form of credit for goods. Once this order of business had been taken care of, the social underpinnings of the rendezvous would then take on a more and more prominent role as the days passed. The notion of the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous as a debauched free-for-all is a slightly misleading one, though not wholly without merit. While some mountain men are in fact well-mannered, well-kempt, and even well-read, some of them do indeed live up to the popular notion of themselves as hard-living, hard-drinking, self-aggrandizing, larger-than-life ne'er-do-wells who thrive in the wilderness but would struggle mightily to fit into civilized society. Among these is a boisterous, bellicose, and often belligerent Frenchman named Joseph Chenard. While regarded as experienced and competent in regards to his profession, one which involved traveling hundreds of miles via canoe and portage through some of Canada's most unforgiving wilderness, he is also resented amongst many as an incorrigible bully and insufferable drunkard. During the previous few days, all of which he has spent in a whiskey-induced haze, Chenard has managed to offend even the cast-iron sensibilities of the mountain men and natives gathered here in the warm, scenic valley. He has not only yelled at, cursed, or been generally impolite to a number of fellow mountain men and voyageurs, he has made the particularly ill-advised choice of making repeated advances on the young, beautiful Arapaho woman named Singing Grass. Singing Grass is an enchantingly beautiful daughter of a chief. In her early 20s, she draws the eye of most of the women-starved trappers at the rendezvous. though none of them dare to make any advances, as it is well known that Singing Grass is being courted by one Christopher Houston Carson. The two had met when Carson's contingent of trappers had traded and wintered with a small band of Arapaho. The Arapaho, whose homelands by the mid-19th century include large swaths of Colorado and Wyoming, are a formidable power on the northern plains. Along with their longtime allies, the Cheyenne, they have long held neighboring tribes as well as prospective settlers under a veil of fear lest they fall victim to one of the tribe's notorious raids. But, as is so often the case on the frontier, they are also known as hospitable businessmen to prospective traders. Many mountain men, Carson included, had cemented deep ties with the tribe over the years. He has made it his intention to solidify this relationship in the bond of marriage once he can procure enough funding from his season's haul to pay Singing Grass's father the necessary dowry. But Chenard, in his drunken frenzy, cares little for Singing Grass's honor, nor Carson's intentions. He repeatedly makes objectionable comments towards her until she is compelled to complain to Carson about his behavior. Kit Carson is known, for the most part, as a quiet, amicable man, notoriously laconic, yet undeniably commanding in his mannerisms and air of competence. Yet he is also known to possess a veritable hornet's nest of a temper, one that cannot be easily quelled in the event that it is agitated. Carson had been born on Christmas Eve of 1809 in Richmond, Kentucky. He had run away from an apprenticeship as a saddle maker and signed on to tend livestock for a company of fur traders en route to Santa Fe. Carson quickly worked his way up through the ranks, covering thousands of miles of territory that was, for the most part, unknown to virtually all of his countrymen. He and his fellow mountain men spend their days setting and checking traps, plodding up and down river valleys and mountain streams, and across vast stretches of empty prairie. It is a hard life, and certainly not for the faint of heart, but Carson has thus far excelled in this high-stakes world. He has time and again proven his mettle in shootouts with the Blackfoot and other native tribes, and by this time in 1835, there are few on the frontier who have at not least heard the name Kit Carson. Though he is not known to be one to initiate confrontation, in this case, with the drunken Chenard openly insulting the honor of Singing Grass, Carson sees no other option and seeks no other option than violent retribution. When news of Chenard's behavior had reached Carson just minutes earlier, his normally placid expression had morphed into an unseemly contortion of contempt and rage. Chenard had been busy all morning, not only making repeated unwanted advances upon Singing Grass, but repeatedly insulting the American trappers in attendance, calling them mewling schoolboys and insisting that he would whip anyone who challenged him as though he were their schoolmaster. As his tirade had dragged on into the early afternoon, Carson, now having gotten wind of Chenard's insults, abruptly made his way across the camp. Carson was a man of imposing physical strength and commanding presence, but relatively diminutive size. As he had neared the mountainous Chenard, it seemed that the Frenchman's prediction of whipping the Americans like so many schoolboys might indeed come true. But Kit Carson was no schoolboy. He had marched up to Chenard and, through clenched teeth and with shockingly cold eyes, told the Frenchman that he would, quote, rip his guts out. The challenge to a duel was then issued, and both men retreated to their tents to retrieve their weapons and horses. The notion of a horseback duel is not at all common in the Old West, and almost immediately, seemingly the entire population present for the rendezvous have assembled in a crowd to watch the fight unfold. As Chenard rides towards the center of camp, now seemingly as animated as his adversary by malice and rage, Singing Grass and Carson's friends grow more and more concerned with the gravity of the situation. They beseech Carson to let discretion be the better part of valor and to let cooler heads prevail. But now, Carson will have none of it. Atop his large sorrel gelding named Apache, Carson, his distasteful smile now growing wider and wider, checks both his single-shot pistols, ensuring they are loaded. He tucks one into his belt and cocks the hammer on the other. He checks to ensure that his hunting knife and tomahawk are securely tucked into his belt and, without a word, wheels Apache toward the center of camp, riding off to meet Chenard. In a scene that begs comparison to a medieval jousting match, the two men face each other from several dozen yards away as onlookers goad them on. Suddenly, there is a collective pause as the gravity of what is at stake seems to sink in for everyone present, except the two combatants. For a brief moment, the surreality of the event is so undeniable that it seems as though the fight will not happen at all. Then, in a near simultaneous explosion of movement, both men spur their mounts onward, pistols drawn, taking aim at their adversary as the ground between them rapidly diminishes. The mere seconds this takes seems like an eternity to all in the crowd, who have by now fallen silent in a fearful awe of what they are witnessing. It seems, for a fleeting few moments, as though the only audible sound is that of the two horses' hoofbeats pounding into the dirt. Suddenly, 2 gunshots ring out in such quick succession that it sounds as if but one shot has been fired. The 2 horses and their riders pass through a small cloud of gunsmoke, whizzing past each other in opposite directions. Carson, still atop his horse, wheels the animal around, unsure if he or the animal has been hit, only knowing that they are both still alive and must now turn to face their adversary for a second charge. However, when Carson turns, he is met with the sight of Chenard hunched over the horn of his saddle, pistol laid on the ground next to his horse's hooves. For a brief moment, Chenard too takes stock of his condition. He is alive, but his wrist has been shattered by the ball from Carson's pistol. The wound is both grisly and debilitating. Suddenly, the air is filled with the howls of the wounded Frenchman, whose inebriation seems to be doing little to dull his pain. Accounts vary as to what happens next. In Carson's own later account, he only mentions that Chenard did not trouble anyone at the rendezvous any further after that. Carson was certainly not above killing, as he had previously and would again kill men who presented less of a direct threat to his personal safety than had Chenard. No record exists as to Chenard's ultimate fate. However, the accounts of Carson that will follow from this moment on will see him grow from well-known tradesman to pop star folk hero in the span of the next half-decade. In a world that is known to be mercilessly violent and universally hazardous, Carson has managed to cement his legacy as a legendary figure who can bear any hardship, solves any problem, and win any fight. While there is certainly a sizable gap between fact and fiction in the recountings of Carson's exploits, his status as a highly skilled, deeply experienced, highly impactful individual in the course of the history of the Old West is undeniable. However, for tonight, the many tales of Carson's other triumphs, tragedies, and controversies are other stories for other times. Klamath Lake, Oregon, May 9th, 1846. In the middle of the night, a group of mountain men lie in much-deserved sleep after a hard day's travel of roughly 60 miles through the rugged terrain of southern Oregon. Their party, 14 strong, is composed of experienced mountain men from a variety of background. Included among them are 3 native Delaware tribesmen, as well as the French-descendant, St. Louis-born Basil Lajeunesse. They are led by John C. Fremont, a former U.S. Army cartographer who has, by means of both merit and a powerful father-in-law, managed to secure himself a congressional appointment to explore the American West. For the better part of the 1840s, he has conducted exploratory missions throughout the West. However, much of the territory he is exploring does not belong to the United States. It, in fact, belongs to Mexico. Though fur trappers, traders, sailors, and whalers have been finding their way to California by sea or by overland crossing for decades now, the territory of Northern California is still, at this point in 1846, relatively unknown and uninhabited. It is owned, ostensibly, by Mexico, as it had been owned by the Spanish before. But in reality, neither government has invested much in the way of resources towards settling the wild lands that lay to the north and to the east of the mission systems that hug the coastline. By and large, this area of Northern California and Oregon is, in fact, under the control of the tribes who have long ruled their respective areas of domain from the San Joaquin Valley to the Cascade Mountains. This meant that the ruling government's headquarters, thousands of miles away in Mexico City, was of little to no use to the Mexican citizens inhabiting the area. However, the land was bountiful, and, at a time when the population was scarcely more than a few thousand people in Northern California, plentiful and ready for the taking by any settler with means and intentions to do so. As was the case in Texas a decade earlier, this openness and availability has drawn a fair amount of American farmers, ranchers, and entrepreneurs. The lack of regulation from the Mexican government provides an enticing prospect for those who have, as of yet, been unable to secure a plot of land and sustain a livelihood elsewhere. The vast, open swaths of ungoverned and unsettled territory also draws the interest of the United States government. Since the expedition of Lewis and Clark 4 decades earlier, the national adherence to the doctrine of manifest destiny has become increasingly vociferous. As the desire for a continent-spanning nation has become more and more apparent amongst the voting public, and the outcry for greater settlement begins to trickle in from Americans living in Northern California, President John Tyler, and then his successor James K. Polk, begin to take increasing interest in wresting the territory from Mexico. But first, the United States must have a better understanding of the territory they hope to overtake and annex. Thus, the services of John C. Fremont have been enlisted on a number of exploratory jaunts that have seen the inveterate, well-connected explorer cover vast swaths of the Rockies and Sierra Nevadas, not to mention numerous trips through deserts and to the Pacific coastline. Fremont now finds himself here, on the shoreline of the vast Klamath Lake, on yet another excursion being undertaken under the decidedly odd pretense of exploring a country that is not his to explore. Now, it seems another layer is being added to this mission by James K. Polk himself. In the week prior, Fremont's company had been surprised on the trail by a hurried, breathless U.S. Marine lieutenant named Archibald Gillespie. Lieutenant Gillespie had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, materializing from amidst the hulking redwoods like a travel-weary specter. Though his presence seems a curious novelty to most of these men, he brings news of great import for Fremont. Gillespie has been dispatched by President James K. Polk himself, with messages for the American consuls in Los Angeles as well as for John Fremont. After making his way from Washington, D.C. to Mexico and then taking a ship to Los Angeles, Gillespie was informed that Fremont's expedition was on its way north, hundreds of miles ahead of him. Gillespie had made an incredible effort through environments that his training as a Marine in the 1830s had not prepared him for, in order to catch up to Fremont and Company and deliver the secret messages. What the messages say will be lost to history, but it is thought to concern Fremont's involvement in the coming efforts to annex California for the United States. The men in Fremont's company are unsure of the exact nature of the correspondence, but are sure that they now find their leader in a fitfully distracted state. He had conferred with Gillespie late into the night as he pored over the letters. He had been so assured of their safety and so ensconced in his new business at hand with Gillespie that Fremont had given all the men license to sleep freely, without posting a guard. While many in the party had seen this as a welcome relief, one man does not. His name is Christopher Houston Carson, otherwise known as Kit Carson. At 37 years old, he is not only a legendary mountain man, but has become an inadvertent pop culture figure. All across the eastern seaboard and the big cities of New York, Austin, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., men, women, and children alike delighted in reading the dime novels replete with highly fictionalized accounts of his daring and expertise. Though Carson is the first to dispel any notion of his own celebrity, his renown is certainly not without cause. He has seen more of the continent than almost any man living at this time. He has traded, fought, and even married into local tribes on the Great Plains and in the vast Southwest. He has survived all manner of privation, hardship, and danger for over 2 decades in locales from the Rocky Mountains to the city of Los Angeles to the sun-drenched prairies of Kansas. He has spent over a decade as a mountain man in the company of legendary trappers such as Bill Williams, Jim Bridger, and Ewing Young. He had married an Arapaho woman named Singing Grass, and the couple had had 2 children. However, in 1839, Singing Grass had died of complications during labor, leaving Carson to care for 2 young daughters. He had remarried to a Cheyenne woman named Making Out Road, but the marriage had ended quickly in divorce, and his children had not been welcome. In April of 1842, after his youngest daughter, whose name is unknown, was killed in a tragic accident after falling into a vat of boiling soap, Carson had decided to bring his surviving daughter to Missouri to stay with relatives. While on a steamboat on the Missouri River, he was recognized by John C. Fremont, who engaged the vaunted frontiersman in conversation and convinced him to sign on as a guide for his new scientific expedition. Carson soon found himself again headed west, providing navigation and direction for Fremont's party. Over the course of the next few years, the two men and their small company would traverse vast expanses of the American West. By 1846, they have already made 2 expeditions and accumulated thousands of miles. By all accounts, Carson has been, time and again, the party's saving grace from certain disaster. However, Carson, despite his notoriety and confidence in his own skills, is a man keenly aware of his own limitations. He is a man from a poor family, and for all intents and purposes, illiterate. His natural inclination, despite his authority and experience and aptitude, is to defer the burden of leadership to the wealthy, well-connected, and well-educated Fremont. So, earlier in this evening, as the men had eaten dinner and prepared their beds, Carson had dutifully obliged to Fremont's decision not to post a guard for the evening. But as much as Carson's mind had prevented him from verbalizing his concerns to his boss, his nerves, acclimated to constant sensitivity from a life spent on the trail, will not let him sleep soundly. Carson feels assured that the party is indeed vulnerable to attack. In the weeks prior to their arrival at Klamath Lake, Fremont, Carson, and company had been involved in a number of skirmishes with natives throughout the Northern California area. The most notable of these being the Wintu Massacre, also known as the Sacramento River Massacre. In late March of 1846, the Fremont party had arrived at the Lassen Ranch in the northern Sacramento Valley, only to be informed by settlers they believed a native attack upon them was imminent. Taking them at their word, and eager to seize an opportunity to both pad his military record as well as to instill some measure of intimidation into the surrounding natives, Fremont headed out in search of the native forces said to be amassing nearby. Under his charge were 60 Americans, including the trappers in his party, as well as, quote, 9 Delaware Indians, 2 California Indians, and 5 members of a nearby trading post. On April 5th, they had come upon a large camp of the Wintu people. Though this was indeed a large settlement, there was no indication that the people within were in the process of marshaling any sort of assault upon the settlers in the area. However, Fremont saw their sheer number and presence in the area as sufficient cause to order an attack. The village was set upon from 3 sides by the forces under Fremont's command. Thomas Breckinridge, a member of Fremont's exploratory party and present at the incident, gave the following account. The order was given to ask no quarter and to give none. The settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. Estimates of the number of Wintu people killed in the attack range from 150 to 700, with many drowning or being shot as they fled into the river. Word had spread quickly among all tribes of Northern California and Oregon of the great massacre inflicted upon the native people, perpetrated by the dark-haired, long-bearded officer and his party of mountain men. Though seemingly untroubled by the butchery, as he had so often been privy to in his life on the frontier, Carson is all too keenly aware of the potential consequences such actions might incur. Sometime after midnight, his wire-tight nerves snapped Carson out of his shallow slumber. Amidst the lapping of waves on the lake shore, the crackling of coals in the campfire, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, an odd, dull thumping noise causes his eyes to snap open, and immediately surveil the campsite. With only the light of the campfire to illuminate the scene, Carson can at first find nothing amiss. Then his eyes settle on the oddly contorted position in which his good friend Basil La Jeunesse is sleeping. "What's the matter over there, Basil?" Carson inquires. Then he notices an odd glistening of the firelight off La Jeunesse's head and torso. Within seconds, the situation is clear to the experienced mountain man. His friend has been killed, bludgeoned by a native warrior's club, and the camp is under attack. Carson, the first in the camp to awake to this horror, calls out, "Indians!" and fires his pistol into the darkness. As Carson's cry is still echoing off the trees surrounding them, the other men are awakened. Lucian Maxwell, Alex Godey, and Dick Owens, all longtime friends and compatriots of Carson's, now have their pistols and tomahawks drawn, eyes searching the night, seeking any kind of available cover. Arrows whistle by them, thudding into the tree trunks as dark figures whirl about just outside the light of the fire. A Delaware tracker known as Crane grabs a rifle and attempts to fire into the darkness, but it is either unloaded or misfires. As a few attacking warriors dash through the camp, Crane attempts to club them with his now otherwise useless firearm. In his fury, he becomes unaware of his position in front of the fire, making him a well-illuminated target for his attackers. Moments after being exposed by the light of the fire, Crane's torso is filled with arrows, and he falls dead. As Carson's eyes sweep the campsite, he hears a loud, guttural moan from his right. Looking over his shoulder, he sees the motionless body of Denning, his good friend and a much-beloved Delaware tracker. Turning his attention again towards the center of the camp, hoping to catch some of the attacking warriors in the same firelight that had doomed the Delaware Crane, Carson sees a lone warrior, resplendent in full war paint and headdress, standing his ground in the middle of the camp, fighting with unabashed fury. With a fine steel tomahawk, he cuts and slashes at the camp defenders, exhorting the other attackers with his war cries. Carson presumes this to be the chief, as do the other experienced mountain men in the party. The next volley of shots from their rifles and pistols renders the attacking chief no more, as he too falls next to the flickering campfire. For the bulk of the next hour, the attacking warriors make repeated, though seemingly haphazard, attacks upon the campsite, hoping to reclaim the body of their fallen leader. Eventually, the attacks abate, and the survivors spend the next few hours in a pensive state, waiting for another assault to materialize from the darkness. Finally, the sun begins to peek over the craggy mountains surrounding the lake. Some of the men set about laying blankets over the bodies of Denny, Crane, and La Jeunesse as Carson and Fremont examine the fallen chief. He is, Carson is sure, a Klamath, a people he has derided before as a mean, low-life, and treacherous race. The chief, now cold in death, his ornate war bonnet crumpled by his last fall, is covered in jagged designs of bright war paint. Carson would later recall him to be the bravest Indian I ever saw. But in this moment, as his comrades lie strewn in death on the ground around him, Carson is overcome with an unconquerable mix of grief and rage. As his eyes blur and his nostrils flare, he deliberately takes the tomahawk, secured to the chief's wrist with a leather thong, from its owner. For a few moments, Carson examines the weapon with the curiosity and awe of a seasoned cultural anthropologist. The weapon is heavy-headed, but well-balanced, the handle sitting nicely in the palm, and its blade razor-sharp. Then, in a sudden torrent of rage that shocks Fremont and the newcomer Gillespie, Carson raises the weapon up and powerfully, repeatedly, smashes it into the face and head of the fallen chief. Again and again, the blows rain down, until the chief's head is, by Carson's later estimation, all knocked to pieces. When his grief is momentarily satiated, Carson confers with Fremont as to the next course of action. Revenge, both agree, must be the order of the day. First, though, there is the business of burying their comrades. The 3 dead men are wrapped in blankets and strapped sideways onto their horses. Fremont and Carson initially planned to bury their friends at a scenic spot on the lake shore. However, as they travel in search of a suitable location, the bodies of the dead men are repeatedly bludgeoned and knocked off of their mounts by the numerous trees that obfuscate any clear path through the territory. Soon, the bodies are bruised, and the task becomes so distasteful that the company of men decide that their unfortunate cohorts must be buried on the spot in the cold, rocky soil of the forest. As a few of the men stand guard, the remainder claw at the ground with their knives, eventually digging out a singular, shallow grave big enough for 3. The men are buried with little ceremony but the prayers of their comrades, and covered with logs and rocks in order to ward off predators. With their comrades now buried, the men's grief and rage runs unfettered. Their first order of business now is to find any Klamath that they can and exact retribution upon them. Their Delaware scouts, after completing their own burial rituals for their fallen comrades, are the first to head out into the silent labyrinth of trees in search of any lingering Klamath. They are gone only a short time when they reappear, this time each holding a freshly taken scalp. "Was sick, better now," one said. The Delaware, Carson, and a small group then head up the Klamath Lake shoreline, scouting for a larger village. About 10 miles ahead of Fremont and the remainder of the men, Carson and the company stumble upon a large village of Klamath. They, too, are quickly spotted by the Klamath, whose women and children scatter in all directions as the men in the village race to arm themselves, and those who had been out fishing hurriedly beach their canoes in a rush to reach their weapons and fellow defenders. With the element of surprise lost, Carson and his men must now make an immediate attack, which they do, with another massacre ensuing. Though accounts vary, with Carson insisting that no women or children were killed, at least one old woman was found among the dead. The huts of the villages are set ablaze, which Carson deems a beautiful sight to behold. As smoke and flames engulf the village, Fremont, disappointed to have missed out on the action, gallops into the camp with the rest of his men. Though he has been unable to catch up to Carson in time for the attack, it will be only a matter of hours until Fremont can claim a coup of his own. As Carson is surveying the destruction wrought by his small attacking band on this, the largest Klamath village in the area, a lone warrior returns and, seeing what has occurred in his absence, draws an arrow aimed directly at Carson. The sudden motion catches Carson's eye, and he draws his pistol and squeezes the trigger, but the weapon misfires. Fremont, a few yards away, spots the Klamath taking aim and spurs his powerful gray warhorse, Sacramento, at the man, trampling him under hoof. The lone Klamath is then pounced upon by a Delaware named Segunde and bludgeoned to death with a war club. Though Carson's allegiance to Fremont has thus far been unwavering, this incident will forever instill an unflagging obedience to the Army officer that will carry on for the rest of Carson's life. Now, as the Klamath village lies in destruction, with Klamath warriors strewn about the ground in their final repose, Carson again confers with Fremont as to their next move. He is informed that they must now, with the advent of the information brought in the top-secret letters by the Marine Archibald Gillespie, return to California. There is a rebellion on against the Mexican government, and Fremont, Carson, and company will all play a pivotal role. The party heads south, leaving the Klamath village to burn and the survivors to mourn. The village is never rebuilt, and the survivors scatter to other bands. Though they have been held accountable by Fremont and Carson for the deaths of their friends, many experts today believe that the Klamath had, in fact, been innocent of any involvement in the attack on the Americans' camp. Instead, it is now believed that the offending tribe had been the Modoc, a culturally related but longtime enemy of the Klamath people. It does not seem that Carson was terribly concerned with the deeds of himself and his men that day as, in his later account, he would deem it a perfect butchery. Carson, though, already a famous figure, will go on to cement his legend in the coming decades, as will Fremont. Few figures in American history have been as consequential as these two men, and their deeds will, for better or worse, carry great weight for years well after their deaths. The stories of exploration, navigation, adventure, survival, combat, and killing seem almost too numerous to tell, and though rest assured, history at the OK Corral will do our best to tell them all, for tonight, they are other stories for other times.
San Diego, California, December 8, 1846. In the middle of the night, in the desert 30 miles east of the city, Kit Carson, legendary American mountain man, lies face down in the dirt, not moving a muscle and doing his best to slow his breathing. Mere yards away, a Mexican soldier on sentry duty sits atop his fine California horse, coolly smoking a cigaretto and enjoying a brief moment of relaxation and solitude in the middle of the Southern California desert. Carson knows that should this soldier discover his location, he and his two comrades will assuredly be taken prisoner and likely executed. Still, as Carson grits his teeth, the soldier remains blissfully unaware of any enemy presence, merely enjoying his cigarette, filling the air around himself with the fragrant smell of burning tobacco, and peacefully observing the night sky above him. The unnerving scene drags on for several minutes, with the silence of the desert night making the already tense air of the situation all but unbearable. Suddenly, Carson grows even more concerned. With one ear pressed tightly to the ground, he hears a faint, thundering rhythm. He wonders if these are the hoofbeats of more California soldiers,
coming to join their comrade. Then, Carson feels a hand nudging one of his boots. As Carson strains his eyes down and behind himself, he sees the cause of the noise. It is, in fact, the racing heartbeat of one of his companions, the 24-year-old naval lieutenant Edward Beale. Lieutenant Beale, his nerves pushed to the literal breaking point, whispers to Carson, "We're gone. Let's jump up and fight it out." "Been in worse places before," Carson assures him, then turns back to flatten himself against the desert floor. Finally, the Californio finishes his indulgent smoke and returns to his main camp, much to the relief of Carson and his comrades. Carson is part of a 3-man group of volunteers, comprised of himself, Lieutenant Beale, and a Diegueño native guide named Chamacta. They are on a mission to reach the American-held port of San Diego in order to send reinforcements back to their stranded comrades roughly 30 miles east of San Diego. The day before, the Americans, a combined force of U.S. Army soldiers, Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers, had fought a vicious battle against the local Californio forces. The battle, known to history as the Battle of San Pasqual, had been fought in the interest of the ongoing Mexican-American War, in which Mexico seeks to retain control of its lands, which comprise most of the present-day American Southwest and Pacific Northwest. When the damp weather had rendered many of their firearms inoperable, the Americans had suffered dearly at the end of the Californio's rudimentary but deathly effective steel-tipped lances. After the Americans were able to bring forth and fire their brass field cannons, the Californio forces had been finally forced to disperse, but not before killing 18 Americans and inflicting countless more deep, grievous wounds in the bodies of the surviving men. Under the command of General Stephen F. Kearny, himself gravely injured after suffering a lance wound to his lower back, the Americans had retreated to the top of a small rock-strewn hill. Here, they found themselves surrounded by roaming Californio forces, who covered virtually all of the territory between themselves and their nearest comrades in the port of San Diego, thus cutting off any hope of escape or relief. The U.S. Army soldiers amongst this group of men under General Kearny had not only survived the battle, they have completed the longest cross-country trek in U.S. military history up to that point, traversing half the length of the continent after marching out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and traveling through Santa Fe. They had then trekked across the barren deserts of the Southwest before finally meeting the Mexican Army in battle here in the desert east of San Diego. Their counterparts in the U.S. Marines and Navy sailors, riding under the command of U.S. Marine Captain Archibald Gillespie, had ridden out to reinforce Kearny's men. Now, these men, many of whom are unable to walk, much less make the 30-mile trek through enemy territory, had to rely on their able-bodied comrades to volunteer to make this perilous journey in order to send back reinforcements and ultimately save their lives. Among these able-bodied men, none was a more obvious choice for this seemingly impossible task than Kit Carson. Among the few participants in the battle on the American side not to hold an official position in the military, Carson has nonetheless already cemented his legacy as an inveterate mountain man, guide, and experienced gunfighter. After deterring a cross-country mission with secret correspondence for President James K. Polk in order to assist Kearny as a civilian guide, Carson had proven an invaluable asset to both the general and his men. Along with Carson, the two other exceedingly brave men, Lieutenant Beale and Chamacta, had volunteered to venture forth into the expanses of the hilly, chaparral-covered desert in order to at least attempt to save their comrades. They had waited until nightfall before making their initial scramble down the sandy cliffs of the rocky hill, being cautious to avoid the Californio sentries that lined the hillsides all around them. By the time the party had reached the bottom of the hill, it had become clear that their metal canteens would be too noisy to carry with them. They had thus each taken one last, long drink and left their only water supplies tucked into the rocks of a small arroyo. Carson and Lieutenant Beale had also discovered that, unfortunately, their hard-soled boots would cause too much commotion while they traversed the rocky ground before them. While their native comrade Chamacta continued on relatively unencumbered and silent in his leather moccasins, the pair of Americans had been forced to remove their boots, tuck them into their belts, and proceed forward barefoot. Now, as the Mexican soldier rides back towards his camp, Carson and Beale are suddenly horrified to realize that, somewhere in there crawling on the desert floor, their boots have come loose from their belts. Considering their already precarious position, retracing their steps to look for the boots is out of the question, and thus both men will have to complete the 30-mile trek through the thorny desert barefoot. With no other option, the three men carry on, silently trudging their way through the sparse landscape, sticking as best they can to the cover of dry riverbeds and small ravines. Despite their lack of footwear, they travel as quickly as possible, knowing that the rising sun will bring with it a host of new problems. Meanwhile, back at the American camp atop the isolated hill, the men find themselves in increasingly dire straits. Food supplies have already begun to wane, as has their supply of potable water. Many of the injured men are starting to see signs of infection, as the deep and incongruous nature of the damage inflicted by the long steel lance tips makes them exceedingly difficult to close and keep clean. Since the day of the battle, Sergeant John S. Griffin has worked feverishly to tend to the Americans' wounds, but it seems to the doctor that a never-ending stream of the bloodied, injured men pour through the canvas-flap doors of his operating tent. General Kearney himself, suffering from the lance wounds that had torn into his lower back and hip, had passed out on the dirt floor of the tent after insisting that more seriously wounded men be tended to ahead of himself. Simply in order to move the injured men from the site of the battlefield to the hilltop, Kearney's men had constructed makeshift travois. These two long poles which connect at a point, after which a bed is built between the poles and attached to a horse, had for centuries provided the tribes of the Great Plains with an effective, efficient means of transporting goods and people. However, on the rock-strewn, hilly grounds of the Southern California desert, they provided a nightmarishly jarring, bone-rattling ride for their unfortunate, incapacitated passengers. Now, the few able-bodied men left have taken to killing and cooking their mules, beginning with the weakest and least useful animals, stewing the meat into a thin, greasy soup that the men do their best to keep down, with some being unable to do so. General Stephen Kearney, suffering greatly from loss of blood, has relinquished command to Captain Henry Smith Turner. The general, who had once led his forces out of Kansas to much nationalistic fervor, pomp, and circumstance, now lies prostrate, pale, and helpless inside of his tent. When they had first arrived atop the hill, Turner had ordered some of his able-bodied men to engage and drive off the California Lancer forces that stalked their movements and harassed them incessantly. This his men had managed to do, with their carbines proving far more effective now that the conditions had warmed and their powder had dried. But now, as the Americans languish on the hilltop, Mexican Commander Don Andres Pico's men and other contingents of Mexican soldiers and California volunteers begin to flood into the surrounding areas, looking to cut off any escape for their enemy and to mount a final charge to decimate their forces once and for all. Now effectively trapped and with their ammunition and food supplies dwindling further and further, Captain Turner is faced with the prospect of either turning out their remaining starving mules and horses to graze, in which case they would almost certainly be stolen by the surrounding Mexican forces, or to slaughter the animals immediately, rendering he and his men truly devoid of any means of transportation, save for walking to San Diego. The American soldiers know that, with every Mexican soldier who arrives to surround their position, the likelihood of Carson, Beale, and Chimocta reaching San Diego has become less and less. Don Andres Pico himself has, in fact, surmised that it will likely be Kit Carson, if anyone among the Americans, who will make a bid to escape to San Diego and secure reinforcements. Though the two men do not know each other personally, Pico is familiar with Carson's prior exploits throughout the whole of Alta California. He knows that Kit Carson is a dangerous man, and that in order to secure a victory for the Mexican forces, he will have to be neutralized. Carson is known amongst the Mexican forces as El Lobo, or the Wolf, and Don Andres Pico has explicitly warned his forces to remain vigilant, or se escapada el lobo. The wolf will escape. Now, as the hours pass on the hilltop, it seems more and more probable to the stranded men that their comrades' bid to reach American lines in San Diego has failed, resulting in either their capture, killing, or both. But, miles away, past the edge of the western horizon, Kit Carson, Lieutenant Beale, and Chimocta press on through the night, accumulating untold damage to their feet as they plod their way through the unforgiving landscape. By dawn the next morning, they are clear of the initial rings of Mexican security forces that surround their stranded comrades. By that afternoon, they are within 12 miles of the city of San Diego. But now, they face the challenge of navigating undetected through the several rings of security forces that surround the city and its harbor. Seeing that seemingly every known path to the city's limits are blocked by the Mexican sentries, the three men huddle in a shaded arroyo and confer upon their next move. Carson advises that they split up, a chilling proposition to all those involved, but a prudent one, as Carson wagers that capturing 3 individuals will be a tougher job for the Mexican army than simply capturing one group. And so, all 3 determine their separate paths, with Chimocta and Lieutenant Beale taking the 2 shorter routes, and Carson volunteering for the longer, more dangerous route. With no time for ceremony or sentimentalities, the 3 men part ways, heading west to the California coast, with each knowing that they will either succeed in their endeavor or, likely, die, and that the lives of their comrades stranded on the hilltop depend on them. All through the afternoon, into the night, the 3 men skulk through enemy territory, each on an individual journey of turmoil, peril, and endurance that will test them to their absolute limits. It will be past midnight when Chimocta and Beale reach the American lines, arriving around the same time, with each man so fatigued that they have to be taken to the USS Congress, stationed in the San Diego harbor, where they will linger near death for several days. Carson staggers into camp around 3 a.m., his more circuitous route having delayed him even longer than his comrades. In a near-delirious state of exhaustion, Carson confirms the location of Kearny and Gillespie's forces on the hilltop with Commodore John F. Stockton. Stockton informs him that reinforcements have been dispatched, and Carson finally partakes in the first food, water, and sleep he has seen in nearly 36 hours. Meanwhile, the men stranded on the hilltop, still with no clue as to the whereabouts of their relief party, continue with their struggle to care for their wounded comrades, with their infected wounds presenting increasingly more frightening spectacles with seemingly every examination, as well as to sustain themselves amid their shortage of food and water. The last of the starving mules are finally killed, their ailing and withered bodies offered up as a last-ditch form of sustenance to their starving masters. Though it is an unfortunate necessity, one that provides much-needed nourishment to the men, the gruesome, heart-wrenching spectacle of this slaughter only serves to further weaken morale, as well as to cement the notion that they are truly without escape in the middle of the barren Southern California desert. In order to quench their thirst, the men dig into the sand, until reaching a layer that has retained some level of moisture from the recent rainfall. The soil is heaped into squares of cloth, then any available liquid, however muddy and disagreeable, is wrung out. For 2 long days and nights, this harrowing ordeal continues. Finally, though, General Kearny is able to regain enough strength to return to command. His field sergeant, Dr. Griffin, informs him that, likewise, most of the injured men have regained enough strength to sit horseback. With their supplies nearly gone, and any hope of rescue seeming to be fleeting, Kearny orders the men to ready themselves for a forced march to San Diego at first light. Come what may, they will not sit on this hilltop to fall prey to their adversaries. At dawn, they will make a run for their lives to the coast. However, that night, as the tired and battle-sore men sleep fitfully, an American sentry on guard is sent into a near panic by the sound of an approaching force of cavalry. He calls out into the darkness, "Halt! Who goes there?" The call, goes unanswered, with the thundering hoofbeats only getting closer and closer to the sentry's position. With his weapon now shouldered, the sentry calls out again, "Who goes there?" This time, however, the reply nearly brings the weary man to tears of joy as Captain William H. Emery, commander of the 200-man relief forces dispatched from San Diego, calls out, "Hold fire, we're Americans." The American camp now resounds with the cheers of men who, only hours before, had seen their hopes of survival as all but lost. In the midst of their celebrations, a single shot rings out from a Mexican sniper hidden in the hills, striking harmlessly into the ground. It would be the last shot of the entire engagement, as the Americans would find all of the Mexican forces gone in the morning, having returned under nightfall to Los Angeles to fortify that city against the newly realized American threat. The combined American forces will make their march to San Diego without so much as seeing another opposing soldier. They arrive on December 12th on a chilly, rainy day, much to the relief of Carson, Stockton, and the rest of their countrymen. Many among the American soldiers are overcome with emotion upon seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time, as the endless stretch of water before them represents the culmination of their unprecedentedly long and arduous transcontinental journey. Though the war is not over, it feels for many of the young sailors, soldiers, and Marines that the worst of the war, for them, has come and gone. The spot where they had made their desperate stand and survived on the flesh of their mules will stand as a landmark of San Diego history, known forevermore as Mule Hill. What has only begun, though, is the national renown and celebrity of Christopher Houston Carson. His leadership during, before, and after the battle, and his willingness to lay down his life in order to aid in the rescue effort, make him a favorite topic of letters written home from American soldiers, sailors, and Marines now stationed in San Diego. One soldier pens a particularly effusive letter home to his parents in Connecticut, proclaiming that, "Never has there been a man like Kit Carson. All that has been said about him, and more, is true. He is as fearless as the lion, as stealthy as the panther, as strong as the oxen. I believe that Carson would attack a fort filled with Mexicans, single-handed, and drive them off." Carson, for his part, barely even acknowledges his accomplishments in his memoirs, writing laconically that, "Finally got through, but had the misfortune of having lost our shoes. Had to travel over a country covered with prickly pear and rocks, barefoot. Got to San Diego the next night." In the years to come, Carson will become a national media star, the subject of dime novels and newspaper articles that will cause his name to be as well known in many eastern cities as the president. The young naval lieutenant Edward Beale is said to have convalesced for an entire year before returning to active duty with the Navy, but he too will go on to national acclaim and a legendary career spanning decades of service in the Old West. Already known as a hero of the Battle of San Pasqual, he would rise to even greater fame in 1848 as the man to bring the first samples of gold from the streams of Northern California to the cities of the East. This tangible proof of the newly won state's gilded bounty would be a key driving factor in the 1849 California Gold Rush, an event that would reshape the nation forever. He would go on to a career as a successful diplomat, serving as superintendent of the Office of Indian Affairs before retiring to life as a rancher. He would remain friends with Carson, who remarked upon seeing his friend aboard the USS Congress that he, quote, "did not think that he could live," as well as maintained friendships with Buffalo Bill Cody, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Ulysses S. Grant, among others. He would pass away in 1893 at his home in Chester, Pennsylvania. Chamacta, the Diegueño native guide, by some accounts took a similarly long time to recover, and, by some accounts, perished as a result of his treacherous journey. His tribe, known amongst themselves as the Kumeyae, already brought to the breaking point under the yoke of decades of California rule, would continue to struggle under the United States government for much of the 19th century. They would play pivotal roles in the San Diego Tax Rebellion of 1851, also known as Garra's Revolt, as well as the Yuma War and even the Mexican Revolution. Today, Chamacta's band, The San Pasqual Band of Diego Mission Indians of California is a federally recognized tribe, with many of their tribal members residing on the San Pasqual Reservation. As for Kit Carson, he will take over a week of recovering in San Diego before regaining the ability to walk normally, his feet so battered by the desert floor that he can scarcely take but a few steps without excruciating pain for days. But recover he will. Carson will soon be on the trail again, heading west to reunite with his family in Taos, New Mexico. Already an American icon and an inveterate frontiersman, Carson will go on to continue his exploits for decades to come. His travels will take him from San Diego, back through the treacherous deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, then to St. Louis, before finally settling in Taos for a few years before continuing his adventures. Though the Mexican-American War in California will continue with a series of minor skirmishes, the worst of the action in California has largely passed. The Battle of San Pasqual will go down as the bloodiest, most consequential battle of the Mexican-American War to be fought on California's soil. The Mexican-American War itself will drag on until 1848, finally coming to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But though the men of Kearny's army can now take their rest, the battles that are taking place further south into Mexico, and the battles that will continue to unfold for the coming year, will go down as some of the most vicious, bloodthirsty combat ever waged in the 19th century. But the stories of the many brutal battles of the unforgiving and highly controversial Mexican-American War, as well as the many tales from the life of Kit Carson, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Northern California, June 25, 1846. In the burgeoning heat of the summer morning, the small village of Sonoma stirs with children at play, animals stirring, and citizens conducting business and carrying out chores. For weeks now, the small hamlet situated just north of San Francisco has been caught up in a groundswell of political upheaval that has been fostering amongst the American immigrants to this territory still owned by Mexico. Roughly 2 weeks earlier, 2 Americans named Fowler and Cowie had ventured to Bodega Bay from Sonoma in hopes of procuring arms and ammunition. They had been caught en route by Mexican guerrilla forces and, after being tied to a pair of oak trees and tortured, had been hanged. On June 14, 1846, the town had been taken over by men claiming it in the name of the Bear Flag Republic. Roughly 30 men, under the leadership of 40-year-old former mountain man Ezekiel Stuttering Zeke Merritt, had taken over Sonoma to essentially no resistance. The founder and mayor of the town, General Mariano Vallejo, is placed under arrest, and a white flag with a makeshift bear on it is raised over the town. The news of this action reaches California Governor Pio Pico, who orders Captain Joaquin de la Torre to take a contingent of soldiers under his command and quash this troublesome rebellion. But, much to his dismay, de la Torre has been repeatedly repulsed by the Americans, who are now calling themselves osos, or bears. The news of this action also soon reaches the ears of one Captain John C. Fremont. Though ostensibly on an exploratory mission at the behest of the United States government, Fremont has long fostered hopes that the Americans living in Mexico's Alta California would rebel against their overseers and annex California in the name of the United States. Now, the ambitious army officer who has advanced to the odd but prestigious position of military officer in charge of a scientific expedition is heartened to hear that his hopes have become a reality. Fremont and his party have spent the previous few years carrying out a variety of exploratory missions that have seen them cover vast expanses of the American West, and California in particular. They have survived all manner of privation, hardship, and travail. Just weeks prior, 3 members of their party had been killed by native warriors, believed to be Modocs, on the shores of what is today Oregon's Klamath Lake. Though many in the band are experienced mountain men and soldiers, they all readily acquiesce to the fact that they owe their survival, in large part, to the efforts of their legendary guide, Christopher Houston Carson, otherwise known as Kit Carson. Though only 36 years old, Kit Carson is already a legendary figure on the American frontier. Tales of his daring exploits in fighting native warriors, trapping little-known areas, and surviving all manner of wilderness hardships are well known by many on the eastern seaboard due to the popularity of the dime novels bearing his name. Though many are largely or entirely fictionalized, and Carson himself often bristles at any mention of his own celebrity, he is a celebrity nonetheless. However, despite his notoriety, Carson is a steadfastly dutiful and loyal man, whose already fastidious obedience to Fremont's authority has been even further solidified since the officer saved his life after riding his imposing warhorse, a large gray steed named Sacramento, over a native warrior who had drawn an arrow on Carson in the woods of southern Oregon. The fact that this had likely saved his life is not lost on the legendary mountain man, and when Fremont suddenly gives the order that the party will make their way to Sonoma to reinforce and oversee the rebel forces, Carson obeys without question. Now, as the party makes its way into the small town during this sweltering morning on June 25th, the townsfolk are brought to a momentary pause. The men, who have for the most part made their homes in the wilderness for the preceding several months, cause quite a stir with the spectacle they present amidst the comparatively genteel townsfolk. In their trek southward to Sonoma, they have taken on several volunteers, and now present a buckskin-clad, ill-kempt, and unshaven multinational spectacle to the observing Sonomans. One among them commented that Fremont's group was composed of Americans, French, English, Swiss, Poles, Russians, Chileans, Germans, Greeks, Austrians, and Pawnees, and if De La Torre could beat them, he could beat the whole world. Within a matter of days, Fremont has taken over the town and taken over leadership of the rebellion. As the ranking military officer for hundreds of miles, Fremont exercises his martial authority over the rebels and promises them protection for their obedience. The settlers of Sonoma agree, even acquiescing to Fremont's request to formally move the recognized start date of the rebellion to coincide with his arrival, to defer all military and civil command to him, and to refer to him as Oso I. He begins signing all letters and dispatches Captain John C. Fremont, Commander-in-Chief of Military Forces in California, and orders the Osos under his command to iron and confine any person who shall disobey your commands, and to shoot any person who shall endanger the safety of the town. Among the Americans now caught in the fray of revolutionary politics and policing is Johann Sutter, a German-born, Swiss-descended immigrant who, in but a few years' time, will change California history forever with the discovery of gold at his lumber mill on the American River. However, now, in 1846, he is simply a prominent local who is beginning to find Fremont's methods distasteful, if not outright untenable. But when Sutter opposes the extremity of Fremont's orders to the ever more haughty officer's face, Fremont scornfully responds that if Sutter has any problems with his leadership, he can simply join up with the Mexican army. Such dismissiveness and self-importance begins to become more and more the order of the day for those dealing with Fremont. He expects those under his command to exhibit only loyalty, obedience, and discipline. One among his party who he can always count on to embody these traits is Kit Carson. Despite his advantage in both experience and ability, Carson time and again plays the part of dutiful sideman, seeing fit only to follow and enforce, but never to lead. However, Carson's reticence to command suits Fremont perfectly, and, of course, when Fremont decides within a few days of arriving in Sonoma that he must take the offensive and pursue Captain De La Torre, he chooses Kit Carson to accompany himself and a small contingent as they set out to engage the Mexican commander on his own ground. The party makes its way southwest from Sonoma to San Rafael, situated just north of San Francisco Bay. On their march, they intercept a Mexican army courier carrying dispatches from Captain De La Torre himself. Following the intelligence gleaned from the intercepted dispatches, Fremont leads the party straight to the northern shores of San Francisco Bay, near present-day San Quentin. However, the courier he has intercepted, as well as the information that the man carries, are all part of a carefully planned ruse being carried out by Captain De La Torre. When the Fremont party arrives on the shores of San Francisco Bay on Sunday, June 28, 1846, they are greeted by a confusingly empty expanse of coastline where they had expected to meet lines of Mexican soldiers ready to meet them in battle. Fremont is both embarrassed and incensed. His hopes of a swift and glorious victory have not only been dashed, but he has been made a fool of by the Mexican officer's clever deception. How, Fremont wonders, can he possibly conduct a successful war against an enemy who refuses to fight and who he cannot find? As the party of men lingers on the shores of the shallow bay, Fremont ponders his next move. He intends to take California by sweeping southward, from San Francisco to Santa Barbara, then on to Los Angeles and San Diego. But now, instead of a decisive victory, he has let his enemy slip away. Then, Fremont spots a small rowboat crossing the bay, headed for shore near he and his party's location. The small vessel makes its way through the brackish, chilly waters to the shoreline, where 3 men disembark and come ashore. They are 20-year-old Ramon de Haro and his twin brother, Francisco de Haro. They are sons of Don Francisco de Haro, former alcalde of San Francisco during the years of 1834, as well as 1838 through 1839. They are accompanied by their uncle, José de los Reyes Berryessa. Though the 3 are clearly civilians and not party to the actions of the Mexican military, Fremont orders Carson to detain them and search them for documents. Carson barks at the confused and increasingly fearful men to hand over any correspondence that they have on their person. All 3 insist that they have none, and are simply on a personal errand to meet friends and family in Sonoma. Carson, still unsure whether the men are telling the truth, calls out to Fremont, who is impatiently seated on his horse roughly 50 yards away. "Should I take these men prisoners?" he asks Fremont. "I have no use for prisoners," responds Fremont. Carson momentarily confers with other members of the party. What had Fremont meant, they wonder. Again, Fremont barks at Carson. "Mr. Carson, your duty." This final admonishment hangs in the air for a pregnant moment as the gravity of Fremont's command settles on Carson and his cohorts. The matter, it seems, has already been decided. Without an instant more of hesitation, Carson whirls, pistol in hand, towards the 3 confused and frightened men. Suddenly, the cacophony of gunfire roars out along the narrow strip of coastline. At almost the same instant, 20-year-old Ramon de Haro falls to the ground, mortally wounded. Before he is able to fully comprehend what is happening, Francisco de Haro falls, mortally wounded, as a second shot rings out from Carson's pistol. Now, as his 2 nephews lie on the beach rapidly expiring, the elderly Berryessa cries out in confusion and grief. His bereaved cries pierce the air until he, too, is cut down by a final shot from Carson's pistol. Moments later, all 3 men, who had only minutes before been paddling across the waters of the bay, all lie still in death. Fremont is, for the time being, satisfied, and Carson, for his part, seems altogether unbothered by the gruesome event. The entire affair, however brief, presents a confounding picture to both contemporary observers and to those viewing the events through the lens of posterity. While it might seem clear to most that Fremont's vainglorious nature provided the catalyst for the murders of 3 innocent citizens, Carson's lack of hesitation or consternation has been a cause for much confusion. While many might attribute his actions to racial motives, Carson was himself married to a Mexican citizen named Josefa Jaramillo, whom he was fiercely devoted to, and had even converted to Catholicism in order to marry. The couple had several children who were not only of mixed blood, but mixed culture, being raised in the inexorable cultural milieu of Santa Fe, the couple's lifelong home. Carson also had been married previously to 2 different Native American women, one of whom had borne him children. Suffice to say, racial prejudices were likely not the driving force in Carson's cold-blooded executions of the de Haro twins and the elderly Berryessa. Nor was Carson party to the fits of jingoistic fervor that so often enraptured his cohorts and countrymen. Though certainly a proud American citizen and at least a tacit adherent to the doctrine of manifest destiny, Carson did not possess an overt passion for the expansion of his country at any and all costs. To Carson, the West was a real place, alive with cultures, conflicts, commodities, and compromise, not an abstract notion that could be conquered in the name of politicians and policymakers. However, with all that said, Carson was a man with an unwavering allegiance to authority. He was largely illiterate and had not been privy to the higher education and high society that many of his superiors had been. Carson despite his record and reputation, felt a seemingly unshakable sense of inferiority when interacting with those imbued with governmental or societal authority. Such was the case concerning his relationship with John C. Fremont. Fremont's pedigree, connections, and title carried such significant weight in Carson's mind that even questioning the officer's intentions seems to have been an essentially unthinkable affront to duty and honor. Further cementing Carson's steadfast loyalty were the events of just a few weeks prior, when Fremont had saved Carson's life on the shores of Klamath Lake. He felt, rightfully so in this case, that he owed his life to Fremont. Fremont, meanwhile, though holding Carson's skill in high regard, seems to have been more than willing to sacrifice the lives of 3 innocent men on the altar of revolution, and to have used Carson as a means of keeping his hands free from the stain of actual blood. Though he had spent many years building his reputation and legacy via treacherous backwoods expeditions, as well as dining room diplomacy, Fremont sees the revolution at hand against the Mexican government to be his big chance at lasting fame and fortune. He believes that without his explicit direction and assistance, the Bear Flaggers are doomed to fail against the mighty Mexican army. He also believes that this revolutionary fervor for independence can be tempered to perfectly suit the desires of the American government in fulfilling the edicts of manifest destiny. Finally, he believes that with the killing of Fowler and Cowie, the 2 Sonoman citizens who had been cruelly tortured and killed by Mexican guerrillas, any and all violent retribution employed against any military-aged male, with even suspected allegiance to the Mexican government, are justifiable actions completely in keeping with military norms. Whatever the why behind either man's actions, though, there is still the matter of the what exactly the men should do next. Captain de la Torre has managed to slip away, and while he is temporarily disadvantaged, he is rapidly heading south to notify his superiors in San Francisco that the Americans in and around Sonoma have now risen up and officially spilled blood in the name of their revolution. Word will soon spread south to Los Angeles, San Diego, and before long, to Mexico City. The response from the Mexican government, Fremont expects, will be swift and merciless, and will soon overrun the Bear Flag rebels. Should Fremont command his party to return to Sonoma, they will be left to wait to receive a series of sizable, relentless attacks from an opposing force with massive advantages in both numbers and firepower. Fremont finds this option unsuitable, for both tactical and political reasons. Should the moment at hand not be seized, the fight for California could prove to be a much longer affair than either himself or the nation have anticipated. Thus, Fremont decides to carry on with the initial plan of attack, heading southward down the California coast. 2 weeks after the killing of the Diaro brothers and Berryessa, Fremont leads his party to Monterey. Here, he will link up with the American naval vessels that dock in the bay, and, after another inconsequential engagement with the Mexican army, continue the march southwards towards Los Angeles. It is at Los Angeles that Fremont will task Carson with his most ambitious endeavor to date. Carson is charged with taking a small party of men and making the transcontinental trek from Southern California to Washington, D.C., with the intention of delivering correspondence from Fremont directly to President James K. Polk. Carson is, for his part, enthralled with the task. He sees this as his long-awaited opportunity to finally rub elbows with the cultural and political elites whose decisions and litigations had for so long shaped his life from afar. The plan is for Carson to then lead reinforcements to Los Angeles to assist Fremont in the final stages of overtaking California from the Mexican government. He will also, by design, be able to stop off in Santa Fe to visit his beloved wife and children. However, neither Carson's plans for a transcontinental odyssey nor Fremont's plans for an easy conquest will come to fruition in quite the way that either man has planned. But for tonight, the tale of Carson's journey to meet the president, as well as that of Fremont's fight to take California and solidify his fortune and legacy, are other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.